All right, so let's start with research and development and patents. Introducing a new pharmaceutical is very expensive. Big pharma companies have the needed capital. We heard about that from Jami, and they're currently incentivized and rewarded through temporary monopolies, 20-year product patents that the World Trade Organization requires its member states to grant. That's the TRIPS agreement, Annex 1C of the World Trade Organization's founding document, adopted in the mid-1990s and valid since then. Now, that means that you finance R&D through large markups that are protected by patents that grant firms a temporary monopoly on their innovations. Here's an example, sofosbuvir. It's a medicine for hepatitis C, a very good medicine, I'm told. It was introduced in the United States some years ago, I think 2013, at a price of $84,000 per course of treatment. A course of treatment is 84 pills over a period of 84 days. So they thought it's a nice idea to make it $1,000 per pill. And that's about 1,000 times manufacturing costs. So it's a very, very large markup, not a 20% markup, but more like a 100,000% markup. Now, prices are so high, largely because of the shape of the demand curve. So, of course, if you have a temporary monopoly, you try to price your product in a way that maximizes your profit. And with a very convex demand curve, that could be a very high price. Let's just look at that sort of Ec 101. You have a demand curve that reflects essentially with important drugs the ability to pay. Everybody wants to survive, but not everybody has a lot of money. So the monopolist here comes in and chooses ideally the price that maximizes the rectangle, this rectangle here, where you choose the price, you get a sales volume that is determined by the demand curve and the price that you have chosen. If you were to choose a lower price, you actually make less money. You do reach more people, but you lose more on the lower markup than you gain by a larger sales volume. And if you choose a higher price, you actually make more money because here you gain more from the greater markup than you lose on the sales volume. So, of course, this is a hypothetical example, but this has been empirically researched quite extensively. And it turns out that within a global market, a high price is going to be profit maximizing. And even in segregated national markets, you do best by ignoring the bottom 85% of the population if you just go by profit alone. It's not the only consideration, but this is the kind of argument that people in the investment committee, of course, or people in the pricing committee, I suppose, would be sensitive to. Now, here we have generic manufacturers that during the time that a medicine is under patent would gladly supply the medicine to poor population at much lower prices, but of course they cannot do so because of the patent. And many, many poor people suffer and die because they cannot get access to medicines at a price that they can afford, even though the medicine exists and even though generic manufacturers exist that would gladly supply it. So granting and enforcing patents is the price that states are required to pay for WTO membership. Before the WTO came along, patent rights were very different in different countries. Generally, countries that were at the technological frontier would have very strong patent rights. Countries that were far behind, developing countries, had very weak patent rights. So India, for example, had 7-year process patents that could easily be circumvented by their generic companies inventing around a particular process. And so Indian population was generally very well supplied, and other developing country populations as well, generally well supplied with advanced medicines. pretty quickly after a new medicine came onto the market because the patent law was weak. But now, as a condition of WTO membership, developing countries had to beef up their patent laws, and that means they had to cut off their populations from these relatively quickly provided generic versions. So it's a little bit like cutting a city off from the food supply in the following sense, right? We have said, we, the rich countries, that is, we have said to the poor countries, if you want to be a member of the WTO, if you want to get most favored nation status and export your products onto our markets, then you have to do us a favor in return. You have to accept very strong patent rights and thereby cut your population off from cheap medicines. And poor people under pressure, poor populations, poor countries, I should say, have taken that bargain, have introduced these strong patent rights, and thereby greatly worsened the access of their populations to advanced medicines. Now, of course, when you say that, the counter argument is that without monopoly enforcement, the affluent would avoid high prices and pharmaceutical innovation would cease. If we allowed poor people to buy medicines cheaply, then often rich people would find a way to also buy them cheaply, and then the incentives for pharmaceutical companies to do their good work of developing new medicines, the incentives would be much weaker. Now, there's not all that much to the argument because obviously rich people from affluent countries will not so easily be able to buy medicines in poorer countries. So there isn't a whole lot of parallel importing going on, but still that argument is often made. But in any case, the main thing I want to focus on that is that the argument that innovation would cease is really valid only if there isn't another way of incentivizing and rewarding pharmaceutical innovation, another way that does not involve patent-protected monopoly prices. So that's what I want to turn to. But before turning to that, I want to look at two other problems with the existing system. One problem that we already know about is the problem of very high prices that exclude the poor during the period that a medicine is under patent. Two other problems are these two. One is that innovation is steered by monopoly patent system, is steered toward those diseases that affluent people have. We saw that very clearly in Jami's presentation, and thereby steered away from the great diseases concentrated among the world's poor, diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, hepatitis, HIV/AIDS, pneumonia, measles, neglected tropical diseases. All these diseases get very little research attention relative to the enormous damage that they still do in this world. The second problem is the comparative neglect of externalities. Externalities, as economists speak, for third-party effects. Generally, purchasing decisions, whether to buy a particular medicine or not, these decisions are made by looking at the potential benefits for the user, for the person who is intended to take that medicine, the patient, you might say. But there are often significant third-party effects, especially with infectious diseases, of course, where you can create great benefits by, for example, vaccinating people and thereby reducing the probability of unvaccinated people getting infected. These third-party effects are generally ignored, and so there is too little innovation in the diseases of infectious diseases, diseases of poverty for the most part, because pharmaceutical companies cannot really hope to get paid for these additional externalities, for these positive external effects. In fact, there is sort of an opposite phenomenon that for pharmaceutical companies, these externalities, these third-party effects can actually be negative, in that by reducing the disease, by shrinking the disease through these positive externalities, pharmaceutical companies would be shrinking their own future markets. So rather than having an incentive to develop and spread medicines that have strong third-party effects, they actually have the opposite incentive if they went solely by their financial interests. So how would the Health Impact Fund address these problems? The Health Impact Fund is a proposed complement to the TRIPS system. It's a fund that would offer to pharmaceutical innovators the option to register any of their new products for participation in 10 consecutive fixed annual reward pools. So the Health Impact Fund would crank out a reward pool every year, a pool of money, and that money would be divided among participating products over a period of, each product would participate for a period of 10 years, and it would be divided each year among the products on the Health Impact Fund in that year, according to the health impact that they would have achieved in the preceding year. Health impact, for the moment, we can just say gets measured in terms of quality adjusted life years. That is a metric for measuring health impact that is well introduced and has been around for around 30 years or so. So the Health Impact Fund might initially be funded at something like $6 billion annually. So each pool would be $6 billion. And this funding that would come from states would be offset, first of all, by large savings on registered medicines. All the medicines on the Health Impact Fund would have to be sold at cost. And it would also be offset by large savings on healthcare costs because these medicines would avoid lots of hospitalizations, third-party infections, and so on. There would also be corresponding gains in productivity and then tax revenues arising from that increased productivities. The Health Impact Fund would allow registrants to keep the intellectual property in the registered product, but that product would have to be sold at the lowest feasible average cost of manufacture and distribution. So, and the innovator would have to grant cost-free licenses after the reward period has expired. So basically, you would produce the medicine and you would sell it at cost of production and distribution without getting any markup at all. By foregoing the markup, you would capture something else, namely the health impact rewards. How do we define the price ceiling, the maximum price at which the medicine can be offered? Typically, we could do that by running a tender, asking the pharmaceutical company to run a tender among competing manufacturers, accepting the cheapest reliable offer, and then buying the product from that cheapest manufacturer, or two or three of them, and selling it at the very same price. So the pharmaceutical innovator would make no profit at all from the spread between buying and selling the product. It would make all of its profit from the health impact rewards. So let's recap some of the features and virtues of the Health Impact Fund. It's optional. That's one very important thing. It would come into the existing landscape as an option. Nobody is forced to participate in it. States would be invited to contribute, and pharmaceutical companies and other innovators would be invited to register particular products. They could choose from product to product differentially, registering one, not registering the other. And so monopoly rewards would still be in play, but some pharmaceuticals would be rewarded in a different fashion. Optionality obviously makes it much easier to establish something like the Health Impact Fund in a gradual way, because we don't need all the countries immediately to adopt it. We don't need all the pharmaceutical companies immediately to jump in with both feet. We can simply allow them to try it out, register a product here and there, and see how it goes. The Health Impact Fund is an example of delinkage. There are a whole bunch of proposals that involve delinkage. Delinkage means we delink the price of a pharmaceutical from the R&D expenses that went into creating the innovation. So that's what makes pharmaceuticals today so very expensive, namely the fact that the pharmaceutical innovator has to recover these very large R&D expenses somehow through the price. That would no longer be the case with the Health Impact Fund, because the Health Impact Fund allows innovators to recover these R&D expenses from the health impact rewards that are funded by states. So these reward payments would come to the innovator, and these reward payments would be based on two factors, namely on how well the medicine does, how much it improves the health of the people who take it and also third parties, and secondly, how wide diffusion it achieves. So the more people the medicine reaches, the greater is its aggregate health impact. The Health Impact Fund ties performance rewards to an objective value standard. So it has nothing to do with the subjective willingness to pay on the part of particular customers, but we measure objectively how much the health improvement achieved by medicine is, and base the reward on that basis. The Health Impact Fund would ask participating states to contribute in proportion to their gross national income. The larger the state is and the richer the state is, the more money it would be asked to put in, maybe 0.03% of their gross national product, something like that. What that would mean in effect is that the richer countries would contribute, relatively speaking, more. If a country is 100 times richer in GNP per capita than another, it would contribute 100 times more. And that's similar to the present system, where also the rich customers pay a very large part of the R&D expenses through the high markups that prevail during the early time that the medicine is on the market, where poor people simply get no access. And that is the big difference. Rich people pay for the innovation and development expenses, but with the Health Impact Fund, they do so in a way that doesn't exclude the poor. With patents, they do so in a way that does exclude the poor. Whoever doesn't pay the high prices doesn't get access to the drug. Now, competition. Featuring fixed annual reward pools, the Health Impact Fund organizes a wide competition, a competition that does not just cover one particular disease category, but really all disease categories are part of that competition. Drugs get registered with the Health Impact Fund and compete for limited annual reward pools, 6 billion we set to fix ideas. And how much you get of the 6 billion depends on how much health impact you achieve with your drug, and also on how much health impact your competitors are achieving, other products in the Health Impact Fund are achieving with their drugs. So that means that the products that will be registered are going to be products that achieve cost-effective health impact, a lot of cost-effective health impact, and probably also products that would not be all that lucrative on the patent track. The Health Impact Fund has a uniform reward rate. Everybody gets paid the same amount of money per unit of health impact achieved. And this reward rate is self-adjusting. If the innovators at some point find unattractive, they say, that's not a lot of money, that's not really worth it, then registrations will dry up. There will be fewer medicines registered with the Health Impact Fund, and that in turn will mean that the reward rate will rise, will recover because of the shrinking number of products. Conversely, if innovators find the reward rate really attractive, they will register more products and the reward rate will fall. So this automatic self-adjustment feature reassures the innovators that the reward rate will always be attractive. An unattractive reward rate wouldn't last. And it also reassures the contributors, the states, that the rate will be held down by competition among innovators. There won't be big windfalls for the pharmaceutical industry, because as soon as the reward rate becomes really attractive, additional registrations would reduce it. Now, what about non-contributors, states that do not wish to be part of the Health Impact Fund system? Well, those who don't contribute, if they are affluent countries, they will simply not get the benefit. So registered innovators remain free to charge patent-protected high prices in those affluent countries. This exception reduces the opportunity cost of registration. So if, for example, Japan decides not to participate, then that means that those pharmaceutical innovators that register the product with the Health Impact Fund retain the Japanese market as one in which they can sell their product at a very high price. So that means you give up less than you might otherwise give up. And it also gives affluent countries more reason to join. The Japanese customers will start asking questions, why does everybody else get this medicine at a low price and we pay these very high prices? Shouldn't we also be joining the Health Impact Fund? The expansion of the fund, over time, the Health Impact Fund might expand through economic growth in partner countries. Remember, it's tied to the gross national income of states. Also, through the accession of new ones, Japan might join the Health Impact Fund coalition and thereby increase the annual reward pools. And there could also be an agreement among participating states to raise the contribution percentage. If the Health Impact Fund gets larger in that way, maybe from 5 billion to 6 billion to 7 billion, it would then attract an increasing number of new innovations. And here's the nice part: the more countries join the Health Impact Fund, the more efficiently it would benefit them by providing at-cost access to a larger number of innovations. So here, a doubling of the Health Impact Fund can in fact quadruple its benefit by doubling both the number of beneficiaries, so more and more people are now living in states that are members of the Health Impact Fund coalition, and at the same time we also have more and more drugs that are now on the Health Impact Fund track and therefore cheaply accessible to all these people. So the Health Impact Fund's growth will disproportionately increase the benefits. The attitude of pharmaceutical companies will be reversed insofar as they participate in the Health Impact Fund. So under the patent reward system, innovators are a little bit like jealous spies. They scour the earth to see whether anybody might be using their molecule without permission, and look everywhere and are always ready to sue people for patent infringement if they find that anybody anywhere has benefited from their product without having paid the markup or the licensing fee that they deserve as owning the monopoly. The Health Impact Fund would generate exactly the opposite kind of motivation, right? Innovators would now say, I want my drug to have as much impact as humanly possible, so please use it. Let me show you how to use it to optimal effect. Let me show you how it can create more health impact. Let's spread it far and wide. And the more health impact gets achieved with my product, the more money I make. So that would be a very nice change that would align innovator motivations much more closely with human health needs in the world. The Health Impact Fund might here motivate registrants to even subsidize the innovation to poor buyers. So sell it for even less than it costs to produce it. Why would one do that? But one would do it because of the health impact that would be added by doing so. By giving my drug at a lower price to poor people, I generate additional health impact and therefore can hope for additional health impact rewards. The more widely and the more intelligently, the more optimally my product is used, the more money I make. So here, firms can often earn more from supplying a medicine than what poor people can afford to pay. That is a key thing, and a key thing also in regard to all the demands that are often heard about we should waive intellectual property rights. Waiving intellectual property rights is certainly a good step by making drugs cheaper, but it also has the problem that for many poor people, even the cost of manufacture is very high and makes it difficult for them to get to the drug. The Health Impact Fund would leave the main pharmaceutical innovation business in the hands of commercial innovators, but it would train these innovators to think much more holistically, to think about the entire chain, all the way from conceiving a drug in a laboratory or on a computer screen, all the way to meeting the needs of the end users, because ultimately you make money only if and insofar as you benefit end users and those living around them, that is to say, patient populations. In this regard, the Health Impact Fund would do well in, or would incentivize and motivate innovators to work together with strategic partners such as MSF, the Global Fund, and so on, which Gary talked about earlier. While monopoly rewards very often put pharmaceutical innovators in a difficult position where they have to decide between profits and people, where they, we heard about that from Jami quite a bit, the Health Impact Fund would do much better at aligning profits with human needs. It would allow innovators to do well by doing good. The question of whether innovators put profits over people would lose much of its significance if these two get aligned. If serving your profit interest and serving people would both support the very same decisions. So innovation would become much more equitable in terms of both the research priorities and also in access to the fruits of research. The Health Impact Fund would guide innovators to make the investment decisions in light of each potential innovation's full expected impact. That's the externality point. And it would facilitate each registered innovation's fast and wide and impactful diffusion. Again, because that is how these innovators would make money under the Health Impact Fund system. And by making the pharmaceutical sector vastly more cost-effective, by allowing it to achieve vastly greater health impact, it would enable a triple win. This greater cost-effectiveness could be distributed in such a way that nobody has to lose through the switch to the Health Impact Fund system. Patients benefit, innovators benefit, and states would also benefit. So the Health Impact Fund is a kind of meta-innovation. It is an innovation in how we incentivize and reward innovations. And it can work much more broadly than just in healthcare. It can work, in fact, in any domain, in any industrial sector of the economy, where a uniform metric of social value can be formulated. The most important and straightforward domains are pharmaceuticals, but also green technologies, right? We have green technologies that often are not used, that are not diffusing, because the people who might use them are reluctant to pay the high licensing fee or the high markup that is caused by the temporary monopolies that the innovators of these green technologies enjoy. Similarly, with agricultural innovations that increase nutrient yield or reduce the need for fertilizers and pesticides, and similarly also in education. So I want to conclude with a few remarks on the pilot. Maybe actually I leave those out because we are far advanced in time and should leave time for discussion. So I'll leave the pilot and invite you to engage in discussion of it. Okay, Tobias.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations of the three of you. I'd like to ask two questions to the last presentation of the Health Impact Fund. One is more technical regarding monitoring systems, because if you imagine this is going to be a success and everyone is trying to measure the impact their own innovation has on people worldwide, then probably you would also need to spend a lot of money on monitoring from which of those innovations the benefit for the certain group of people would come from, and there would be a competition over the health, over the impact rewards and these kind of things. So are there estimations on how much this overhead of the fund to organize this whole system could be with regard to the money they would spend on impact benefits, for example, or impact rewards? This is the more technical question. And the other question is, imagining I was a very affluent, rich state, and we have learned that those states usually have diseases that are either coming from the system of food production, like diabetes, heart attacks, and all of these things, or they are rare and are usually not the diseases the people in the poorer countries face. So is the benefit for affluent states really there, so that they would save enough money to join the impact fund for cost reasons? Or is this the problem that Jami Taylor said, that there's no bipolar market, if I phrase it correctly? Or
Good. Let's get the other two questions in also, then we make sure that they're all heard. Harrison?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us. My question is also around the Health Impact Fund. Like, I think it's obviously an amazing idea, but and I guess you were going to touch on this in terms of the pilot, but how do we go from idea to then reality to that extent? And like, you know, is there like an in-between state that can also be very beneficial, and, you know, even at a sort of startup level for this?
Good. Radian.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody who presented today. I thought the presentations were quite brilliant. My question was whether, when implementing the Impact Fund, whether you envision that although every country pays the same for the price of these drugs, whether there is a risk of some form of strategic collaboration between states where they promise the delivery of time-sensitive drugs like the COVID vaccine to certain countries before they are delivered to developing countries, and how the Impact Fund would counteract that.
Okay. Good. Let me see what I can do with these questions. The first question about monitoring. Basically, what we have decided is that we want to keep the monitoring cost at no more than 10% of the overall cost of the Health Impact Fund. Secondly, we want to charge the monitoring costs, not pay it out of the Health Impact Fund's budget, but actually charge it to the drugs that are registered. That may seem like it makes no difference, because either way, right? Either you sort of charge them, but then pay them more, or you pay it yourself. But it does make a difference, because it means that the drugs that have more health impact, they pay the same fee, so to speak, as the drugs with less impact. And that strengthens the incentive to register drugs that have really an amazingly large impact, and it discourages registration of drugs that have are not expected to have a very large impact. Now, with these 10%, we would have, if we have 6 billion to start with, we would have 600 million to measure health impact. That's an enormous amount. It's much, much bigger than any kind of impact measurement that has ever been done before. And it would still be, of course, rough. We wouldn't have very, very precise measurements about how much impact a drug has, but we don't need those to provide the right incentives. So the important thing is that pharmaceutical innovators understand that the best and only way for them to get a larger slice of the reward pie is to achieve more health impact. They understand that they will sometimes be over-assessed or under-assessed, but in the long run, it's roughly right. And most importantly, the only way for them to be successful and get a lot of money is to achieve a lot of health impact. So the incentives are right. The second thing about the benefits, it's of course right that in the early years for sure, the diseases that will be tackled by health impact fund registered drugs are for the most part going to be the major infectious diseases of the developing world. And those are not highly problematic for rich countries. And so on a strict cost benefit calculation, you might say, this is not a good deal for Germany. Germany pays a lot more than Senegal because it is richer, and Senegal will get more of the benefit because it has more of those diseases. But of course, there are public health reasons for investing. You are already in the business of doing the development assistance. So you have reasons of development assistance to do that if it is an effective complement to the Global Fund, for example, which you're already supporting, or PEPFAR, or many other of these initiatives. You might say that it makes sense for us to contribute to it. And there's also the argument concerning invasive diseases, as we have seen in the recent COVID case. We are all vulnerable to these kinds of diseases. And the time where we can just say, let diseases breed all they like among the poor, and we worry about that later, if and when they come to our shores, that's not a very good strategy. So I think there are good reasons for the richer countries to get into that. Gary, you want to add?
Just to add one thing, our judgment that non-communicable diseases are not to be treated in poor populations, and therefore those are not the diseases of those populations, is a paternalistic and essentially socially unjust perspective. It turns out that we all have the same genome. It turns out that one of the other factors that's a risk factor that doesn't occur quite as much in older people, in the poor populations, is aging, and those people in fact don't age because they have lower life expectancies. So the treatment of cancer is as necessary in the poorest populations, and the 21st century treatments of cancer should be as available to those populations. We are sitting in the developing world and watching people die of early stage breast cancers that have fulminating lesions that have never been changed or treated because of lack of examination or interventions, cervical cancer because pap smears are not available, a variety of valvular heart disease because we don't treat streptococcus in children, and renal failure because we don't treat hypertension or streptococcus. And so those diseases are there, and the egalitarian availability in a market way could in fact be addressed by this across drug types. And to some extent, the bizarre incentives to create the second tier of drugs and or taking the same drugs and making them in fact orphan drugs in the way that Jami described them would be undermined by this process.
Okay, so I mean, the question is whether medicines for these kinds of diseases, which medicines would be registered with the Health Impact Fund initially. And I think it would be, you have to think about it in two terms, right? One is, what is the cost effectiveness? How much health impact can you achieve for a given amount of money, let's say research and development investment? And you have to also think about the opportunity cost of taking it off the patent track. So if you had let's say a new drug, a really breakthrough drug in cancer, chances are that people would calculate that it would make more sense to leave it on the patent track than to put it on the health impact fund track. Which is not to say that that's a desirable outcome, of course.
Well, although to Jamie's other point, I mean, there's a huge political influx of attention to drug pricing in the United States, which is the cross-subsidy. So if in fact the ceilings are lowered from that 300 times that she showed in that graph, or in fact if NICE is more effective in the UK or the EU is more effective reducing access for subpopulations, then it becomes an incentive to go to the health impact fund.
And I would just add that the current political environment is creating a much more constructive set of trade associations that represent the industry, which is indicative of and presents opportunities to drive toward this openness. We see, I think, in the Health Impact Fund, a really nice, not just complement, but counterbalance to some of the dysfunctions and imbalances of the current system, which indeed drive R&D decisions into these narrower slices for profit maximization. And what we're missing across the board are incentives to drive access. It's missing in the priority review voucher, which is intended to drive innovation in neglected tropical diseases and now pediatric cancers, but initially neglected disease. And to the extent to which that has been successful as a tool of policy, many times what's been created is the so-called access dilemma with respect to the priority review voucher, which helps to bring innovation to a certain point, to the point of market approval, but not the point of access. And here with the Health Impact Fund, where you've draped an incentive over to the access side, you have something that many of us within industry would like to see come to fruition, because the absence of incentives in that all important category means that imbalances can only worsen from here.
So let me quickly say a few words about the other two questions. The reality question, how do we get there? How do we institute the Health Impact Fund? That was what I wanted to talk about and didn't get to, the pilot project. So we have a pilot in the works, hopefully with support from the US Congress. And the idea is to have a single pool of $100 million, a much smaller pool, where we would ask pharmaceutical innovators not to innovate and develop a whole new product, but rather we would ask them, with one of their existing molecules, is there something you might do in a developing country, in a poor country, that would really create a lot of health impact. And we would ask for proposals, select the best 3 or 4 proposals, give these proposals 3 years' time, and at the end of the 3 years, we would evaluate how much health gain they will have produced with their initiative. So we would divide the $100 million according to health impact, just as the Health Impact Fund suggests. And these would be initiatives bringing an existing product or a modification of an existing product into a resource-poor setting. So what that would do is it would, first of all, show that we can measure health impact. Secondly, show engagement on the part of the pharmaceutical industry. And thirdly, give us a sense of what kind of bang for the buck is possible. We would invite pharmaceutical innovators to look for really low-hanging fruits, where they say, it's such a pity, you know, we have this great drug and it isn't available in Africa, or it isn't available in Cambodia, where it's urgently needed. Let's bring it there. Now with the Health Impact Fund pilot, we can afford to do so. And we hope that that is a good stepping stone for then getting the Health Impact Fund established. With regard to the vaccination problem, that's of course something that we should discuss in greater detail. But basically the Health Impact Fund approach to this would be to say that we should offer pharmaceutical companies a generous fixed rate per immunization, which is the same, you know, regardless of whether populations are rich and poor. Try to get the production of vaccine revved up as quickly as possible so that we produce a whole lot of vaccine. Let the various companies that now have a working and approved vaccine on the market, let them compete for the amount of vaccine, the number of immunizations that we need. The world has 7.8 billion people, so 6 or 7 billion vaccinations are needed, and then distribute the vaccine that we purchase through that facility in by medical criteria. That is to say, without any attention to how rich or poor these populations are. That would be the pure mechanism, but of course, we can't prevent any particular country from trying to outbid such a mechanism or to do their own thing separately. But the mechanism would work, it could still work today. We could institute it, and we have something a little bit like it in COVAX. COVAX could be slightly modified to fit that. And we would then at least make sure that vaccine production is revved up as quickly as possible, and also make sure that nobody is left out. Everybody who wants to be vaccinated does get vaccinated. Larry, anything to add to that?
No, I think you did a brilliant job in describing the fund and also in showing how malleable a political tool it is, as well as an economic tool. Of course, mentioning the caveat of vaccine nationalism and the insanity associated with that created both the policy issues that Vanessa described on the one hand, and the behavior of each of the countries that have distorted the markets. And so if you have something that's a market cure, it's harder to use it as a tool under those circumstances when the market is flooded with $1 trillion that de-risks a variety of investments and changes the marketplace. But I think it was a beautiful description.
Good. Enzo?
All right, thank you all for presenting today. Earlier, Dr. Gottlieb spoke a little bit about the problems that lack of infrastructure poses for developing countries in particular. And Professor Pogge, you just talked about the HIF and how it solves that access to medicines problem. How do we solve that there's almost like a space between the lack of infrastructure and the lack of medicines, and while we're solving the problem of access to medicines, we still have a lack of infrastructure that's going to make the HIF a bit problematic in some of these countries. How do we solve that problem to ensure that when the HIF does come into effect, it can reach everyone it's supposed to reach and have maximum effect?
So let me say one thing about it, and Gary and Jami may also want to weigh in on it. The one thing I want to say is we would have the pharmaceutical companies on our team with that. If there is an infrastructure problem, if there is any problem, any barrier between my product and its health impact, then that is something that hurts me financially as a pharmaceutical company. So I will bring my very considerable resources, financial experience, political connections, and so on to bear to try to help solve these problems, right? That is not always going to be sufficient for sure. You have to have cooperation from the national health systems and so on and so forth. But the Health Impact Fund would change the equation in one respect, that in very much the right direction. It would give pharmaceutical companies an incentive to bring their capacities, their considerable capacities, to bear on helping to solve that problem.
I'll just add a very concrete point to that. When we think about the R&D process, you see this folding in of what you might argue are infrastructurally important tools to drive measurement. And in particular, you see sophisticated diagnostic tools being folded into the process of R&D to be able to measure health gains. What I see with the Health Impact Fund is the opportunity to bring that same sort of model, which guides clinical trials and the outcomes measurements thereof, to bring those important tools, including diagnostic tools for the measurement of health gains, and also to drive infrastructure development. So you can see pharmaceutical companies recruiting with this power and with this new incentive to drive access and the measurement of impact, bringing in diagnostics, which are critical to health systems strengthening. I also see an opportunity for, as we think about allocation of resources and infrastructure development, for burdens of access, really moving away from entities like the Global Fund and giving them more headroom to be able to drive health system strengthening, and putting more of that heavy lifting in the lap of pharmaceutical companies who, for the first time, really have a financial incentive to drive that access. And so you've got health system strengthening carried out by the entities that Gary has illustrated and outlined for us, and the pharma plus diagnostic component and that engagement in markets like never before. This is where you get the correction of imbalances. And again, it's that draping of incentives in the direction of access that I think solves some of these problems around infrastructure development, which heretofore have been intractable.
I think it's fair that there would be a redistribution of responsibility and that one would start to align incentives in the way that both of you describe. The critical issue is principal investment in health system strengthening to start. Healthcare is a human right, and in the absence of sustainable solutions that strengthen those health systems, many of the medicines, as you're describing, become irrelevant. So as Tobias was suggesting, having a comprehensive cancer center in Rwanda is a fantasy unless there's an NGO that just happens to be doing it and has a variety of different entities, but there isn't democratization of the treatment of cancer. The challenge is that, as was evident in all the lists of the 8 entities and their processes, is that most of those solutions are vertical. So vertical solutions around vaccination, around food, around HIV treatment, around TB, have created pathways of massive funding without ever building the foundations or building the sustainable solutions. The Gates Foundation has been a series of silos and a series of siloed vertical investments in specific solutions rather than health system strengthening. It spent almost nothing in that area, and it becomes problematic. So I think we need to pull back for a second. There's no question we need to focus on solving the policy issues around translation, but in terms of implementation, there absolutely has to be an accepted world standard in terms of a minimum that around the overall healthcare infrastructure that is light years ahead of where we are right now in terms of being able to create those solutions. And bringing the pharmaceutical companies as our allies is fabulous, but if they only focus on the solution related to the implementation of their specific solution, we have another vertical. The same way that right now we're asking, in value-based payment in the United States for insurance companies to solve the social determinants of health without investing in a social safety net. And they'll invest in it for the people who are members of their health plan. And so nobody else in the neighborhood will get access to food security or housing security or employment or investment in schools. And that's a silly expectation. Not that this is silly. This is critically important, but we need to look at the whole and not the silos of the verticals.
And I think what's so important is that the fact is that when you sit around the investment committee table or other boardrooms in a pharmaceutical company, oftentimes when we talk about engagement in frontier markets or some of these more difficult settings, there's what I can only say is an excuse, and that's the sense that there's not absorptive capacity to drive access to medicines. So then there's this reliance on the proverbial chicken and egg problem. Well, we can't bring medicines because there isn't the infrastructure. And that becomes its own out. Where we can drive a new level of engagement, I think there's the opportunity to at least change the game in the direction that Gary's recognized, understanding that the Health Impact Fund, to be successful, must be the long game. And pharmaceutical companies must recognize that it's not one and done single solutions, but this is a long-term incentive program that will incent them to innovate and provide access across a number of different therapeutic areas now well into the future. And that's why going beyond the pilot and seeing beyond the pilot and planning beyond the pilot is so important at this stage. And with that engagement and removing that excuse or stumbling block of absorptive capacity as part of really truly achieving impact, that's part of the long game indeed.
Okay, you're all free to leave. Obviously, we are over time, but we will hear from Jim.
Well, I wanted to address a broader question about trying to get traditional human rights organizations involved in these issues about global healthcare. And I guess I would love to hear from all three of you, but especially, well, all three of you, basically about how we characterize this problem as a human rights issue on the ground, given your profound experiences in places like Haiti and Rwanda. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of that, but I'd love to hear it from you about positioning global healthcare as something that Amnesty, for example, should take an issue on, take a stand on, and provide some campaign support for this kind of proposal.
Well, you know, I think you just basically made the argument without me having to say much more. There's, you know, basically healthcare is a civil rights issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a basic principle, and you know, while we now have focused on the social determinants of health, it's health overall. So in the absence of housing security or education or training or frankly, feminism, we won't in any way thrive or survive. And the challenge is that most of our human rights folks, as brilliant as you are in supporting them, are transactional. And this is broad-based policy and foundational. And so this is democracy in its most extreme sense and a human right, and it, you know, moves broadly across the age span. So I think that those partnerships are critical. The problem is, you know, we verticalized issues of human rights as well. So, you know, for everybody to be incented based upon their narrow solution, we don't find a broader solution. And that's, you know, obviously, you know, you can't boil the ocean constantly, and it's wonderful that the people focused on those areas, but, you know.
That's helpful. Yeah.
And we'll let Thomas have the last word. I'll just say, in the interest of moving beyond silos, look at building bridges with strange bedfellows. And certainly the pharmaceutical industry has a spotty history and recognizes its own complicated reputation with respect to human rights issues, going back probably most starkly for many of us who are veterans of the industry to pharma's lawsuit against South Africa with respect to access to HIV medicines, as many of us remember, and quite unfortunately. But the industry is in a moment of evolution. I think there's an opportunity to strike strange bedfellow relationships with companies, especially progressive thinkers within the industry, to really rally around them and look for points of intersection. There's an opportunity to really embrace the industry like never before and without compunction. So I hope that today was the start of a potential bridge building in that direction. Thomas?
Yeah, I share that hope, and I would just reiterate one point that I made in my presentation, namely that often the problem of global health is presented as a problem we should do more to help, we being the Western affluent countries. And as I think the remarks about the TRIPS agreement show, it's not just that we are not helping enough, we have actually created a huge problem, right? We have forced developing countries, and in particular India, which was the pharmacy of the world before the WTO treaty, we have forced them to institute very strong intellectual property regimes that actually prevent generic companies that are perfectly willing and able to provide medicines cheaply to poor populations in the developing world, prevent them from doing so. And so we have actively intervened in the situation in a way that causes millions of deaths each year. So of course we have a defense for that. We said we need that in order to make our pharmaceutical innovation system work optimally. But we have to find a way to make it work optimally that doesn't kill lots and lots of poor people in the developing world. You know? So I think this is a very, very serious human rights problem, not just a problem of not doing enough to promote human rights, but actually actively violating these human rights.
Great point. Great presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Jami, and a wonderful session, and it will all be up on YouTube within a few days. Thanks to Michal.
Thank you for including me, and thanks for allowing me to be exposed to this wonderful class of people.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Be well.